All right, everybody. Just like that, we are looking at week 3 of our course. We have several chapters. Remember, we're not covering all the material in the chapters, so just kind of look at the study guide. The study guide is guiding you to the information you need to know. Information in the PowerPoints. I try not to go over absolutely everything, but reading the book with the reading assignment with your study guide and completing it is a really good way to learn the material. Now, I understand that it's a lot of information and students are reaching out feeling a little overwhelmed. So the best thing to do is just chunk it up. I know it's hard because you've got full-time jobs, you may have kids, you may have parents you're taking care of, all these responsibilities. Just carve out, a couple times a day, a chunk of time when you can sit down and get things done when you're 100% engaged. So I know it's hard. Hang in there. Virtual labs will earn you 90 points if you do them all. Do your study guides and do them thoroughly. That's 125 points that you earn. So that really should kind of give you some cushion for some grades that might go up and down, as far as exams and lab practicals. But anyway, here we are, Chapter 12. I've got my study guide 3 by my side so I can make sure to concentrate on the things that I've told you that you need to know. Now, let's just not overthink things, right? The skeletal system. You know that the skeletal system is made up of the skeleton. Boom. That's going to tell us that there's a lot of bones involved, and all the functions of the bones are things that we need to understand as being a function of the skeletal system. But we also know the skeletal system works with the muscular system, and that's how we're able to move all of our appendages and our body parts, and it's just simply incredible. So remember that. The skeletal system provides attachment sites for the muscles, and the muscles, when they can contract, move the bones. And together, this gives us support and movement. Now, the skeletal system itself has a lot of other functions we'll get into in just a moment, but that's kind of the gist of the big picture. Now, you might remember in the last module that we talked about 4 different types of tissues in animal bodies, and we talked about connective tissue. You might remember bone and cartilage, tendons and ligaments, joints, and even blood and fat are part of the connective tissue. So don't forget that. We're also going to take a deeper dive into a cross-section of bone and take a look at some things that it's doing beyond just, supporting and giving structure to our body. Cartilage, remember, tips of our nose, our ears, and our joints, and part of our ligaments gives us that flexibility. And tendons, of course, connect our muscles to our bones. So these are also super important to connect the skeletal system to the muscular system. Okay, so looking at the function of the skeleton, you already know that it supports the body and that it works with the muscular system, so it's moving the body. So let's just take a little deeper dive. Let's think about the skull. We have the cranium covering our brain, pretty significant. If you've ever had a TBI, or if you were a football player or a soccer player, and like I'm thinking about soccer and the World Cup and doing lots of headers, man, you better have some protection for that freaking brain, right? It jiggling inside of the cranium can certainly give you a TBI. So let's think about the cranium protecting our brain, our skull in general protecting our sense organs and our brain. Thinking about our rib cage is protecting, your heart and your lungs. Pretty significant, right? A couple significant vital organs. So remember that, protecting your organs. Now, along your back, you probably already know this, starting right at the base of your skull, you have a series of vertebrae. It forms the vertebral column or vertebral column, and inside that column is a canal, and along that canal is our spinal cord. So the spinal cord is that major nerve, essentially carrying information from the brain out to our appendages and all over our body, and from our body to the brain. So we've got to protect that spinal cord. So it is inside the vertebral canal. Okay. Red blood cells. Where are red blood cells made? Well, they're made in the bones. So if you've ever known anyone who had multiple myeloma, a type of bone cancer, then certainly you might have been hearing connections between red blood cells and bone. Lastly, bone, you need calcium for your bone. And so your bone is literally acting as an on-demand source of calcium. So when you need it for muscle contraction, guess what? We kind of digest our bones away a little bit. And we're going to talk about the scrubbing action that occurs so that we can release calcium a little bit later in the videos for this chapter. There's another important mineral that is stored in your bone, and that's phosphate. So we have these important minerals that when we need them, we can take them from the bone, and when we have excess, then we put it back in the bone. And there's actually hormones that are going to be facilitating what we're doing with our calcium and phosphate. Lastly, we do store fat in our bones. So it might seem kind of odd. Plenty of us have, little belly fat, particularly females, protecting our reproductive organs. But that fat inside of the bones is actually going to give essentially a shock absorbent nature to the bones so that they can withstand some blows without breaking. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at what the figure is called the anatomy of the long bone. And we can essentially look at this figure and learn a lot of terms. So I don't know about you, but I can look at words until I am blurry in the eyes and I'm like, oh my God, another term. Or I can look at a picture and a figure and I can study it and think about the terms and the definition of the terms and the function of these parts and learn a lot more than all the written, definitions. So I'm looking at my study guide. It's chapter 12, number 3. And so let's just take a look. Okay. At the very end of our bone, we have the epiphysis. Okay, this is actually showing us what is likely the humerus bone. So that is your upper arm bone. And essentially you have the very end. So the epiphysis is the very end of the bone. In this particular case, it's rounded because it goes into a ball and socket joint. Okay. On the outside of the epiphysis, there is this coating of cartilage. You might imagine, what is cartilage good for in our joints? It's good for the movement of the joint so that it's nice and smooth. When we wear away that cartilage is when we have more bone on bone rubbing and it's painful and it's destructive. Okay, I want you to look just below the epiphysis. There's the epiphyseal plate. Okay, this is the growth plate. So if you ever broke a toe or broke a bone, maybe when you were 10 or 12, one of the things they were looking at was to see if your growth plate had closed. Okay, healing occurs really quickly in youngsters, right? So the epiphyseal plate is the plate or the tissue, if you will, that is going to give rise to the bone as it's growing. So this is essentially the growth plate, if you will. So that line there is showing us in this particular bone that it's mature and it's solidified. So the bone is no longer growing as far as elongating or getting bigger. Okay. The next thing that we see is just below or just part of the epiphysis, you see that this bone has this kind of spongy nature. It kind of looks like coral, but when I think of maybe a sponge from the ocean, it's full of pores. And so that's the spongy bone. And it has a role in essentially containing the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow makes red blood cells. So all throughout this part of the spongy bone, the bone is making red blood cells. Now, when I'm thinking about bone too, it's not an empty type thing. Like when we go into a lab, we might look at a bone, and maybe it was actually a human bone, and you see that it's all hollowed out, and in the spongy bone, it looks kind of like that. There's nothing in it. But in reality, this is filled with material. So the bone is literally being supported from the inside out. Okay? So we have the spongy bone. Now take a look on the outside of the bone. There's a very, very, very dense layer, and it's called compact bone. It is super dense. And why would it be super dense? Because again, thinking about blows to your arm or to your cheek, this compact bone is going to protect from trauma, essentially. When we take a look at the center of the bone, okay, in the center of the bone we have what they call the medullary cavity. So this is the yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is essentially fat. Okay, So again, inside the bone, it's filled with fat, so it's going to help support it. And if you take a look between the medullary cavity and this compact bone and the very outside of the bone, we have something called the endosteum. So I want to show you that in more detail in just a little bit. And then we see that on the outside of the endosteum, we have the periosteum. So peri means to the outside. So we have these different parts of the bone. Last but not least, we have the elongated portion of this bone. The longest part is called the diaphysis, which I don't see that on the terminology, but you get the idea that there's regions of the bone. Okay, and the big one there is the epiphysis and the epiphyseal plate, which is essentially the growth plate. Okay, so here, if we take a look at the bone, and I'm really taking a look at the endosteum, and I'm magnifying it. This is incredible to me. So if we take a cross-section of bone, we start to see the rigid nature of the bone. So what's going to make it so supportive? So what we see in this bone is, where's my little pointer, is essentially magnified here. They're trying to show us an osteocyte. So here is the bone cell itself, which you can't really see here. But in these little pale areas where it looks kind of slightly grayish, we have essentially those bone cells. And the bone cells are inside like a circle, if you will. So it's got this area called lacuna, which doesn't really matter, you know. But anyway, what we see is that these bone cells then are essentially connected by these strands of fibrous type tissue, and then embedded in those strands then is going to be the bone cell, the osteocyte. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever studied botany, which is like my favorite thing, but if you take a cross-section of a tree, it looks so much like this compact bone. So in thinking about how we design a structure that's very rigid, well, the way that we would do it is we put these bone-producing cells, osteocytes, in a little bit of a cavity. Turns out that's probably going to give it some protection, right? And then you take that same unit and you repeat it all over and over again, and then you connect it with strands, and now you've got this very, very rigid and structurally sound material. Now, in the very center of these osteons, which is showing us here, you see that there's actually blood supply. So we can't forget that even though we don't normally think of our bone as bleeding, our bone is the source of red blood cells, and it also is a living material, so we need to supply it with, you got it, arteries, veins, and then, of course, we have some nerves. All right? Okay, so some things here. I am going to move on, but if you want to look at anything from here, do that now. The only thing that I'm thinking I need to point out is chondrocytes. You might remember cyte means cell. Chondro is referring to cartilage. So chondrocytes are the cells that make cartilage, and they also lie within a special space, the lacunae. Okay, now getting on to something a bit easier. So now we are going to take a look at the anatomy of the skeleton, and we have really two different parts, or you could even talk about them as the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So in this figure, what has been highlighted in blue are all bones that are part of the axial skeleton. Axial comes from the word axis, so this is the main axis. So think skull or cranium, facial bones, then that's going to protect your vital organs. So we have your rib cage, your sternum, and of course the main axis of the body is the skull going down your vertebral column. So essentially, axial skeleton is the main axis. The appendicular skeleton, which that term looks like the word appendage. So we're talking about the bones of your shoulders, your arms, your hands, and your essentially your lower appendages, which are your legs. So we have your hips or the pelvic girdle, and the bones of your legs and your feet. So we'll pause here and go to part 2.